In the past couple of lessons, we have been talking about adding and subtracting fractions. Today we're going to add another layer onto what we've been doing with that. The layer that we're going to add on today is that now we are going to work with adding and subtracting mixed numbers. We are going to track through a process, a set of steps that we can use to add or subtract with mixed numbers. You'll notice on your notes outline that there are two different examples, example 1 and example 2. We are going to go through the different steps and we're going to look at what happens with the examples as we go through those steps. So below each step, you'll see what each example looks like on that step to help you understand how the steps work and what the process looks like. As we go through this, you should be filling this in on your notes outline. Yesterday, we talked about the fact that if we're going to add or subtract fractions, we need a common denominator. That is still true. So that is our first step. So we're going to start by tracking through this by looking at example 1. So we have fifths and halves right now. So we need to make that have a common denominator. So the least common denominator would be tenths. So I'm going to go through and change it into tenths. So 6 and 4/5, we want to change that into tenths. So to get from fifths to tenths, we need to multiply by 2. 5 times 2 is 10. The top also needs to be multiplied. 4 times 2 is 8. So 6 and 4/5 is the same as 6 and 8/10. Now we have to change the 3.5 into tenths. So to get from halves to tenths, we multiply by 5. So that means the numerator also needs to be multiplied by 5. 1 times 5 is 5. So this is the same as 6 and 8/10 plus 3 and 5/10. The second step happens if we're subtracting. Since example 1 is an addition problem, we are going to skip that step for now, and we're going to come back to that step when we look at our second example. So what we want to do next, we get to skip down to the third step, is we are going to add or subtract. So in this case, adding, since we're looking at an adding problem right now, add or subtract the whole numbers. So the whole numbers in this problem would be 6 and 3. So we're going to do 6 plus 3, which gives us 9. Now the next part is going to be to look at the fractions. So add or subtract the fractions. So we're kind of breaking these numbers into two parts, the whole numbers and the fractions. So the fraction part of that is 8/10 and 5/10. So we're going to do 8/10 plus 5/10. So 8/10 plus 5/10 is 13/10. So now we're going to put those parts back together. So 9 is our whole number, 13/10 is our fraction. So this looks a little bit funny, but that's because we need to do the last step, which is to simplify. So this may include rewriting the fractions that are greater than 1. So when we added 8/5 or 8/10 and 5/10, we ended up with 13/10. So 13/10 is greater than 1. So we can actually take this fraction and we can rewrite it. So 13/10 is the same as 1 and 3/10. So that is that just rewritten with the whole number that's hiding in there pulled out. So if we put this back together, we simplify it, 9 and 13/10 is the same as 9 and 1 and 3/10, which we can now clean up and say, okay, 9 plus 1 and 3/10 is actually, 10 and 3/10. So that would be our final answer. So that is how you can add mixed numbers. So the trick is to actually deal with it in two parts. Deal with the whole numbers, deal with the fractions, and then put it back together when you're done. Now we're going to come back through here and we are going to look at example 2, which is subtracting. So in this problem, example 2, we only actually have one fraction starting off. So we don't need to worry about a common denominator because right now we don't have a denominator in the other number. But we do need to deal with our second step. So when we're subtracting, sometimes we need to do something called regrouping, or another way of thinking of regrouping, it's kind of like borrowing. So when you guys learn to add and subtract with whole numbers, you learned to, or to subtract with whole numbers, you learned to borrow if you didn't have enough to subtract. So we are going to have to do that with this because we can do the 2 minus 1. We can do step 3 just fine, subtract the whole numbers. But where we're going to run into a problem is on step 4, subtract the fractions, because in order to subtract fractions, we need to have a fraction in both numbers. So right now, there's no fraction for us to subtract in this number. So what we're going to do is we're going to regroup the two. So when we go to subtract the fractions, we have something to subtract 3/7 from. So we need a fraction in both of these numbers when we're subtracting. So we're going to regroup the two. And since this is in sevenths, we are going to pull out one whole. So we're going to change 2 into 1. We're pulling out one whole. One whole is 7/7. So 2 can be rewritten as 1 7/7. So we're going to regroup that 2 into 1 7/7 and turn this problem into 1 7/7 minus 1 3/7. So now when I go through and I get to the subtract the fractions step, I have fractions to subtract. So now we're going to go through our steps. So subtract the whole numbers. So 1 minus 1 is, I don't know why this wants to keep zooming out on me. 1 minus 1 is 0. Now we're going to go through and subtract the fractions. 7/7 minus 3/7. That's why we did the regrouping, so we have fractions to subtract now. 7/7 minus 3/7 is 4/7. So now we are going to take the parts and put them back together. So we ended up with 0 for our whole number. So we ended up, if we put the parts back together, with 0 and 4/7. Because we don't have a whole number, we could take that 0 off and just say 4/7. So our final answer subtracting is 4/7. So the process is similar for both of these in that they share these steps of looking at just the whole numbers and then looking at just the fractions and putting them back together. But there are a couple of differences. Subtraction might have this extra regrouping step, and addition might have this rewriting step that you have to do. But the steps are very similar. If you track through these steps, it will let you add or subtract fractions. So now you are going to work on your U-try to see how you do with this.